us, we have all failed. In many ways, the loss of life in San Bernardino is an indictment of our institutions, our religious institutions, our educational institutions, our law enforcement and justice institutions have all touched these young people who are losing their lives in some way, and we have failed to preserve the most sacred thing, which is their breath, right, their life. Like, this works. Like, this works in terms of the personal transformation that happens when you do go to where the blood is being spilled, but then also the what we're describing, and there'll be a couple key things, but it has worked all, and it will be unique. You have to create it in a way that has fidelity and integrity in your community, but this works. And it just requires the deep collaboration, because none of us can do this by ourselves, and no single element. And this is why what Sergio is saying is so important. This is why the suppression never works. It never works completely, right? Because it's only one dimension of it. It requires this kind of collaboration. Out of the 11 cities that attempted to do this, 10 of the 11 cities had significant reductions in homicides. Significant, ranging between, I think at the lowest, from 22 to 63%. From 22 to 63%. And it was around this question of the cost of violence. And Pastor Reverend and I were talking earlier about, sort of the importance of policy solutions. Just to put it in a policy context, this is what the Center for Disease Control estimates. They say it's $5.1 million. That's what every homicide costs. $225 million. That's what it cost the city of San Bernardino last year. What we know works is when you have a partnership strategy that employs respectful, direct communication with those people who are most at risk of shooting or being shot. So this is what all the data teaches us. It's less than, what we found in Richmond, it was actually, like, statistically, of people who are actually, it's less than 0.5%. What's the narrative about young people of color in San Bernardino? Right? The troublemakers. They're inherently violent. All this stuff. It's just not true, right? But and what happens, right, is that we're not focusing on those people who are most at risk of hurting someone or being hurt themselves. Does that make sense? And then the violence spills out, right? So, because what allows for the violence to occur and continue, right? It's the isolation, and it's that they're anonymous, right? And that they are not seen. You really have to stay laser focused on reducing shootings, right? If for this to work, you want to stay laser focused on the violence. The violence has to be the priority. And this is what the data shows, and what our experience was, is partnering with law enforcement is important if you want to reduce violence. It's critical at some level. And by us getting in partnership with them, we were able to challenge them with more integrity and change the culture. You just have to have open eyes and be willing. And you have to be willing to be willing to fight. We would fight a lot, but we made an agreement is that if we were going to fight, we would communicate directly to each other before we would go out to the press. Right, and if we weren't able to resolve it, we would still reserve the right to go public and attack them, and criticize each other. Essentially, a communication strategy that can prevent violence. But the communication strategy can't be just through law enforcement. So I'm going to go through all this real quick. So again, the approach is community, civic leadership, working together to communicate this violence, this anti-violence message. Our message was alive and free. It was very simple. We love you. We want you to be alive and free. The shooting has to stop. That was our message. We would repeat it hundreds and hundreds of times a day. Before we launched any of this, we had the police do an in-depth analysis of all of the patterns of violence. So we could identify all of the groups that were most engaged, all of the neighborhoods. We created what were called heat maps. So I'll show you an example of that. So that helped to reinforce all of our community-based strategies with the night walks, and it would focus all of this. And then we would develop, the law enforcement has this, but a list. And that list would be vetted by our street outreach partners. So then we would focus on essentially the people who are at highest risk. So then the next is respectful face-to-face communication. But this is what's key to sustain it, is that there has to be realistic alternatives. Realistic alternatives, but there also has to be real accountability. Real accountability. What we would always say is, we can't commit or promise you anything, but we can commit that we will walk alongside you and we will do everything we can to help. Like, if you were a victim of a homicide, only 10% of homicides were solved in our city over about a 20-year period. So you can imagine, right? Like, what is the long-term impact of that? People don't feel protected. Right? They don't feel like their lives matter, and they see it over and over that people take someone's life and there's no consequence. Communication strategy, prioritizing violence. And this is not only law enforcement, but your elected leadership, right? The way that we got this to be a priority is we forced our mayor and all our city council members to make this a priority as well. And law enforcement was executing the priorities of the city. And because you're trying to create a group culture. And there are a couple things, right? Important that there's clear legitimacy, right? And that there's integrity. That's why the night walks are important, because it shows a deep level of commitment, and all the other pieces are important. The power of the community voice, the importance of partnership, and then the clarity and the unity around the message. And so this is sort of like, if we can do the next slide real quick. So there's roles, right? Like our call-ins were always led by the community. We always had formerly incarcerated people speak. We always had the parents who had lost loved ones to gun violence speak. And we always had service providers that were in the room. Ours were always in a church. We always had people who were there. We had a team of volunteers who would would greet people and meet with them, and so they would, so that they would feel. We had one woman, Benny Singleton. She was a grandmother, and she had lost her grandson. He was murdered when he was 18, and she would hug every young man that would come in the room. And again, this connection to services and resources is really critical to incorporate and weave into it. Every community that I visited that has tried this, they all say, it won't work here because of everyone will say that. Your law enforcement will say it, people in the community will all say it won't work. I'm just telling you, it will work. This works wherever you are, at least in America, as long as, like, you do it, like, you actually integrate all of these different things. You can't just do only night walks. Night walks by themselves doesn't work. Law enforcement suppression by itself doesn't work. Only services by itself doesn't work. You have to have all these things together, and you have to do it well, with integrity. That's the key, and you cannot give up. It is guaranteed to fail if you give up.